Hey, so the last video in this kind of blitz of comic book thoughts was centered around around fantasy, and I've kind of found a theme for it, but there's no real theme for this except I'm going to talk about a bunch of science fiction comics that I read in the past few months, and maybe some kind of pattern will emerge. Probably not, though. One that I really like a lot is Invisible Republican. Invisible Republican. They make a joke about that in the letters page, actually. They say, "Welcome back to the letter column, Invisible Republicans." That doesn't sound so good. Anyway, although that was just kind of a little bit of a joke about our current politics, and if you were doing a comic book, you probably don't want to say all your readers are invisible Republicans. But anyway, this is a very grown-up, sophisticated comic book, and I guess because of that, I always put off reading it. It's harder to read than the average comic book I get. I always am delighted when I do read it, both by Gabriel Hardman's art and by the script by the couple, the married couple of Gabriel Hardman and Karina Bechko. And I read several issues in the past few weeks, but I only could find issue 9, the most recent issue. And it's feeling like more and more of a relevant political kind of story, even though there's no making it obvious what the ties are between this and our world. But you can see the patterns of history and government and the personalities behind history and government all in here, and the way we treat different classes, what's behind the economics behind wars, all kinds of things like that. It is kind of convenient in science fiction where you can take the let's say the white characters and make them a position that historically been perhaps the position of black characters. Not that they're just being repressed by other white characters on other planets or the like. Although there is an attempt to make a mix of races. There's scattered different shades of skin colors in here. But still, I was thinking about that. Science fiction has a tradition, at least in America and England, I think, of being for white people. There's a few exceptions of that, like Samuel Delaney, in the science fiction prose world of Samuel Delaney and I can't remember her name, Octavia Butler, but they're few and far between. I don't mean that at all to put this particular book down. I just sort of thought about that because you have people on one moon who are being used by the richer people on another moon to fight a war against people with a strange, different culture on this other planet. So, during the Vietnam War, it was noticed the army had a much higher number of minorities than reflected in our culture, and those people were sent off. I think on a bigger level, which completely applies here, the poor people are sent off to war by the rich people, and it serves the rich people's purpose, not the poor people's, in many wars. Now, this feels so layered, we may continue to get different views of the past history here. The layers are getting to be a bit confusing, and maybe that's also, I think it all would make sense in the trades, but that maybe also, as month by month it comes out, I kind of procrastinate on reading it. But I always end up feeling it's like one of the best books I read. It's just kind of difficult. And science fiction at its best can be difficult. And case in point, Omega Men, which is also political in a kind of a different way. In fact, both of these feature a woman from the ruling class who's also playing on the side of the rebels, and that's interesting. I don't think one's imitating the other in any way. Does that reflect a projection of those of us even in the middle class, but certainly in the poor, fantasizing about a relationship with a person from the ruling class who will pull us up, but is somehow sympathetic with our cause? I don't know. That just popped into my head. So I can't seem to find the most recent issue of Omega Men. This is from 2 months ago. This was kind of a confusing issue. Well, it seemed like it had jumped ahead a bit too quickly, the previous 2 issues. And then issue 8, which I don't have in front of me, gives an interesting bit of backstory. And kind of like Invisible Republic 9, pulls back and gives us some more big picture information. Omega Men 8 does that in a really big way, detailing this whole planet and what is kind of at the core of the current political issue. And it's pretty damn major, with the idea of sacrificing this one group of people for what the leaders supposedly believe is the greater good. And then that sacrifice leads to this later rebellion of the Omega Men. So these are big, heady issues. Luckily, particularly Invisible Republic lets you draw your own conclusions. Omega Men also, for the most part, lets you draw your own conclusions. And it wants to be a trip of doubts and not knowing which character is good and which character is bad and having it go back and forth. There was a lot of that in issue 7. So I'm not calling Omega Men the brilliant masterpiece that I thought it was after 4 issues, but I'm still calling it one of the most fascinating comic books out there, and I really am interested to see how it will spool out. I guess I could have grabbed The Vision, also by writer Tom King, because that's kind of a science fiction story, like an iRobot kind of story. But both the Omega Men and The Vision, we now know both of them are going to go for 12 issues. So it'll be interesting to see how he pulls them both off. They're each kind of like a standalone novel done in comics. Right now, Tom King is for me the writer to watch in comics at the moment. The most sort of exciting, what will he do next? Will he move on to higher and higher levels of greatness, or will he flatline? We've seen writers do both in the past. And Lord knows, my little bit of writing fiction experiences, it's hard, and you can write one good story and then write a whole bunch of bad stories. So it amazes me when there are these guys who can write good story after good story after good story after good story. I think that's pretty unique. Well, speaking of that, shuffling the order here a bit, let's talk about Saga. I mean, Brian K. Vaughan, I look forward to all of Brian K. Vaughan's books, and there's always a lot of good stuff in them. And Saga, has been one of the books that has really, cemented me into this current phase of being really into comic books. And we're up to issue 34. I think it's been going for 4 or 5 years now because of all the breaks. And not enough can be ever said about Fiona Staples and what a great artist she is. And she continues to kill it on the quieter scenes and the big scenes, the gross out scenes, the really cool stuff. Just the covers alone make her amazing. But there was this 3 issues ago where Alana and what's his name, the guy, jump off into the ship. Followed shortly by, well, I don't know if I should show it, an after sex scene. What's amazing to me, because I was looking through these 3 issues to remind myself, I've just read this issue, to remind myself all that's happened. The big point that I remember most as a big drama must have happened at least 4 issues ago, which was when it was revealed to someone in the sort of detainment center. Revealed to someone in the detainment center where... now I can't even remember the name of the daughter. What's her name? Our main character. I guess it's a little bit of a negative on Saga that the names don't jump out at me. Anyway, the daughter, when the revelation of her wings to one of the teachers, and so they pick up on that plot in this issue, but I guess it was at least 4 issues ago that we had that revelation, because I was looking through these 2 issues and there was nothing about that in this. This issue was mostly the adventures of Marco and Alana, and this one was the adventures of the reporter and the photographer who turn out to be gay lovers from a newspaper within the robot empire, I guess. I mean, they don't look like robots and they don't look like people with wings. They're some other kind of alien. And you know how Saga's always trying to have the shocking scene, and in this issue it seemed like the shocking scene was supposed to be the gay lovers having sex. But I thought, compared to the graphicness, the intimacy of some of the other shocking scenes in Saga, this was one of the paler ones. And the scene that actually shocked me most was the revelation of the Will, who has now gotten a serious case of a middle-aged potbelly. You don't see that in comics too often, where the character shows up a few years later and is fat, who used to be athletic. So for me, that was the big shocking reveal of the issue. And maybe it was intended to be because it's a full-page thing. So that is totally for a subtle shocker for people who've been reading a long time. And it's never emphasized. They never talk about the fact that he's fat and overweight. Did he look as fat and overweight in the next issue? I'm not even sure about that. So it's kind of hard to talk about this as science fiction. It's got so many things going on. Yeah, so I guess he's still fat and overweight there, but they're not really emphasizing his portliness. And in fact, there, he's fighting a serpent, so he does have a gut there. But he's still got his moves and his macho fighting kind of guy stuff. So I guess my real point there is that Saga has slowed way down. They used to pack a lot more information and new things per issue. So the fact that what's been happening to the daughter has been spread out over at least 4 or 5 issues, just the current beat of her story really showed that to me. And I guess, they had good intentions trying to make this couple who are reporters interesting, but this was just kind of a dull issue, and it just seemed to be not quite a filler, but almost like a filler issue. Let's just focus on something else for a little while and rest our plot. What is interesting, and I wish there was more focus on, was Prince Robot raising his son. And maybe we will get more of that coming up. Prince Robot's being pulled into doing helping with a rescue, and so yeah, Prince Robot's interesting. The Will is interesting. These guys have always been like the most interesting characters in the book, the kind of the bad guys. Although they're treated less and less and less like bad guys. So definitely still very interesting where Saga's going. So yeah, I guess then I'll do Paper Girls afterwards. This is becoming more and more and more and more of a science fiction book with twists and crazy time travel or alternate universe stuff going on and all kinds of stuff. I have to say, because I'm a big science fiction fan, I love this. But people who came into this because they were interested in a group of 4 or 5 girls who are friends in the 1980s, it's kind of slipping away from that. The 1980s are less and less an important feature of this, with all the other wacky things going on. And it's really more about time travel and crazy ideas about the future and stuff. Maybe the girl adventure stuff will tie in more tightly later on, and we will focus more on that and be less distracted by all the fireworks, science fictional fireworks. But I don't mind all the science fictional fireworks. And it's a beautiful package. Feels like it's interesting. It feels like the paper in Saga is flimsier than the paper in Paper Girls. Anyway, 2 beautiful, amazing books that Brian K. Vaughan is associated with. But at the end of this issue of Saga, every once in a while I get little hints that I think Brian K. Vaughan might be a person who would kind of annoy me. And in this issue is the 2006 Saga Reader Survey. And I remember the first reader survey, and maybe there's been more than one reader survey, but I only remember reading the questions of the first one and quickly deciding not to send in my answers. And this one has other small annoyances in it where I feel like Brian K. Vaughan is kind of patronizing, and I'm the superior liberal, whether you're a fellow liberal or not. I'm kind of the uber liberal, not the uber liberal, the alpha liberal that you need to follow, and I will play my little manipulative games with you. So he asks questions like, well, the one that caught me was, if you could have a conversation with the men and women who assembled your smartphone in China, what would you ask them? Now, clearly he's asking that question because the implication is these people are working under horrible conditions and we should all feel guilty about having our smartphones. If that's really his position, why give me a snarky question about that? Why not write in here and tell me what smartphone he uses that is so much more politically correct, and tell me how to get it and how to help the people working under bad conditions in factories. Instead, he's like, oh, I'm all superior. Let me make you feel guilty about your smartphone. Another question was, who are your parents bigoted against? Like, oh, we're all so cool and we're better than our parents. Certainly I could answer all those questions. I have opinions on all those things, but it's just the tone of that. And then other questions aren't necessarily so politically loaded, but they just still have the taint of some kind of pleasure in manipulating your audience. How significantly has your relationship with your father contributed to your current situation in life? Do you have any fetishes you've never shared with a partner? If you could draft any living person in the world to be president of the United States for one term, who would it be? Well, that's a little more interesting. Would you personally execute a convicted death row inmate if it meant extending the life of your favorite pet by 10 years? If you weren't so afraid, what would you be? Talk about a question that's designed to put me, the person asking the question, in the superior position. When you can't sleep at night, what is the one thought you can't let go of? Anyway, I would never write in the answers to those questions, but it just gives me the taint of annoyance with this fellow. But I've wasted a lot of time on that. Sorry about that. Black Science was one of my favorite science fiction comics, one of my favorite comics altogether. It got a little too much craziness, piled on craziness, piled on craziness. in its first, I guess, 16 issues or so. Now we have a new arc called God World, of which we've read the first 4 parts. And that seemed promising at first. It seemed to slow down and explore one adventure over a 4-5 issue phase with our hero Grant alone rather than with the whole group. But it's kind of devolved into this science fiction. I mean, the art's still amazing, but this science fiction as psychobabble, science fiction instead as a trip inside your mind. And as such, it just seemed way too on the nose and not nearly interesting enough to be spread over so many issues. So it feels a bit, if it weren't for the amazing art, it would feel like kind of a waste of my time. And now by issue 20, we have him sort of having resolved his psychological problems by this science fictional trip inside of his head. You know, I psychotherapized myself by ridding myself of my demons. Now he's supposedly going to be the heroic Grant Morse, Grant, whatever his last name is. And Grant has somehow, while he had amnesia, built this amazing version of the machine that helps him travel between universes that can just about do anything for him. So now he's like the overpowered superhero. I assume that Remender's going to shoot him down from that. But either way, I feel like we lose. He's become too perfect, or we've watched him struggle and supposedly solve his psychological problems to become perfect to only be shot down again, in which case we would be starting back at where we started. Okay, here's a book that I really love, and it's done. I guess there was only 4 issues. It was The Rook, written by Stephen Grant, art by Paul Gulacy, based on a character called the Rook that they used to do in Warren magazines. There was even a magazine called The Rook for a short period of time, one of their black and white magazines. And before that, he was one of their most popular characters in the later issues of, I want to say, Eerie. It was either Eerie or Creepy. But he's a time traveler who's a bit of a cowboy, and there's just kind of a wacky craziness to it. And in here, he has adventures with H.G. Wells and with the actual time traveler and inventor of the time machine that H.G. Wells based his time machine book on. And I have a special love for H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, and you can easily argue, and many people do, that The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is the first real science fiction novel. So I love playing around with that, and that makes science fiction, time travel, one of the most sort of basic tools of science fiction. And I don't know, to me, The Rook just does a wonderful job of playing with the twistiness of that and playing with my knowledge of the book, The Time Machine. It might be a little harder to read this if you don't have any memory of either the movie or the book, The Time Machine, and the Morlocks and the Eloi and all of that stuff. But if you remember it, if you've picked it up enough from a movie here or there or read the book, I think you'll get it. So I'm hoping Dark Horse does miniseries mostly, so I'm hoping they'll do another Rook miniseries, hopefully with the same team. It was just kind of a delicious, fun romp, and I'm really sad it's over. Okay, the final science fiction in my pile here for today is Justice League 3001, which is arguably a superhero book, a spoof of superhero books, but also a wonderfully wacky, intricate, far future science fiction story that is packed with DC characters, all of which have something wrong with them, compared to how their real characters are. And in this issue, we have Eclipso, if he has any powers, or just because he's one of the characters in the future has been turned into Eclipso by this character, Lady Styx, who also calls herself the Lord of Everything. Um, there's Justice League 3001's been a bit up and down, with some issues seem to just be standing in place. But in the issues where they really get going, like this previous issue, I think was a bit standing in place. But the issues where they really get going, there's this wonderful energy to it, and it's so light on its feet, but with science fiction elements that somehow really work for me. So anyway, I think this will be wrapping up maybe at issue 12. The most recent issue was issue 9. I think there could be 3 more issues before Rebirth. So and that would make sense. It's by the year. Before there was Justice League 3000. So 12 issues to cover the year 3001 would work. And I'll probably have had enough of the Justice League in the year 3000, 3001 by the end of this. But I'm really glad that this series existed and that I got to read it. And I think what makes it so fun, I mean, the spoofing of the superheroes is fun, but I think seeing them set in this huge interplanetary backdrop with all this wild science fiction imagery is just what makes it exciting. And wild science fiction imagery is in all of these books I talked about. The least wild maybe being the Invisible Republic, where we still have 2 moons and an alien planet, but we're down in the dirt, literally at times, with the politics and the working class and the different classes. And, black science just lives on its wild imagery. So science fiction is something, because it's so much about going to wild and wonderful places, but believing them in a little bit because of a little bit of a sense of the possibilities of the future and stuff. And that sense of just a touch of somehow that it could happen, I think gives it a different feeling than fantasy. Anyway, it's really well suited to comic books, I think, because you can have unlimited special effects, and the artist's imagination, when you've got the good artists, like Matteo Scalera, can just go anywhere and just amaze you. And they do amaze me. Okay, I will probably do some more comic book thoughts in the next day or two.